The night I cut my family out of my life wasn't dramatic. Sighs. There were no slammed doors, no screaming matches, no plates shattering against the kitchen wall. No final speech where I stood in the middle of the living room and told everyone exactly how much they had hurt me. It was quiet, in a way that almost felt ordinary, like the kind of night that would fade into memory without meaning anything at all. I packed 2 suitcases. That was it. One held clothes, mostly things I had bought with my own money from working late shifts at the small bookstore downtown. The other held the things that mattered more: my laptop, a few notebooks filled with half-written ideas, a framed photo of me and my college roommate laughing on a beach, and a small stack of letters I had written to myself during the worst days of my life. I didn't take anything else. Not the furniture, not the decorations from my childhood bedroom, not even the old teddy bear my grandmother had given me when I was 6. Leaving it behind felt strangely symbolic, like closing the door on a version of myself that had spent too many years hoping for something that was never going to happen. I carried the suitcases quietly down the hallway. The house was dark, except for the faint glow from the television in the living room. My parents had fallen asleep on the couch again, the same way they did most nights, half watching whatever show Daniel had recommended earlier in the evening. Daniel. My older brother had always been the center of everything. The golden child. The one my parents talked about with pride whenever neighbors came over for dinner. The one whose accomplishments were displayed like trophies in every conversation. Daniel got the best of everything growing up. The best school supplies, the newest phone, the most attention. When Daniel brought home a report card with a B on it, my mother hugged him and said the class must have been difficult. When I brought home an A-, my father would glance at it and ask, "Why not an A?" It wasn't that they hated me. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, I existed in a strange, invisible space where my successes were expected and my struggles were personal failures. Daniel was allowed to be human. I was expected to be perfect. I remember one Christmas when I was 12. Daniel had asked for a new gaming console that cost more money than I had ever seen in one place. My parents bought it without hesitation. When it was my turn to open presents, I unwrapped a set of notebooks and a pack of pens. "Since you like writing so much," my mother said with a smile. I thanked her. I always thanked them. Even back then, I knew better than to complain. As I reached the front door that night at 23 years old, I paused for a moment and looked back down the hallway. My parents were still asleep on the couch. The television flickered quietly, casting blue light across the room. For a second, I wondered if I should wake them, tell them I was leaving, give them one last chance to say something that might make me stay. But deep down, I already knew how that conversation would go. My mother would sigh and ask why I was being dramatic. My father would say I was overreacting, and Daniel would probably laugh. So I opened the door instead. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside. I loaded the suitcases into my car slowly, my hands shaking more than I expected. Not because I was scared of leaving, but because part of me still felt like I was doing something wrong. Walking away from your family feels unnatural, even when staying hurts more. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring at the dark house. 23 years of memories lived behind those walls. Some of them were good. Birthday cakes, school dances, quiet evenings reading in my room. But most of them carried a weight I had spent my entire life trying to ignore. The constant comparisons, the small jokes at my expense during family dinners, the way conversations always shifted when I started talking about my goals or dreams, and the moment that finally broke something inside me. My engagement party. Mark had planned everything carefully. He rented a small private room at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown. The space was warm and intimate, filled with soft music and tiny fairy lights that made the whole place glow. I remember feeling nervous the entire drive there. Introducing Mark to my parents felt like the final test of something I had been hoping for my entire life. Maybe this would be the moment they saw me differently. Maybe they would finally treat me with the same pride they showed Daniel. Mark squeezed my hand as we walked into the restaurant. "They're going to love you," he said. I wanted to believe that. My parents arrived 40 minutes late. My mother walked in complaining about traffic while my father checked his phone. Daniel followed behind them, already halfway through a story about a new business idea he was working on. They barely looked at Mark. The dinner started awkwardly, but manageable. Conversations drifted from work to current events to Daniel's latest plans for a startup company. Mark tried to include me in the discussion, asking about my writing and the online shop I had just started selling handmade stationery. Before I could answer, my mother waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, she's always doing little projects like that." Little projects. That phrase stuck in my chest like a splinter. Halfway through the meal, Daniel stood up and tapped his glass with a fork. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced with a grin. I smiled nervously, expecting something sweet. "To my little sister," he began, raising his glass. The room went quiet. I'm honestly shocked someone decided to marry her. The table erupted in laughter. Not polite laughter, real laughter. My mother laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. I felt my face burn as every person at the table looked at me. Mark didn't laugh. He squeezed my hand under the table, his grip tight with anger. But the damage had already settled deep inside me. Something about that moment made everything suddenly clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't bad communication. This was simply who they were, and who they believed I was. The family joke. The disappointing daughter. The one who should be grateful anyone wanted her at all. Sitting in my car that night, staring at the house where I had grown up, I realized something that terrified me. They were never going to change. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how kind or patient I tried to be, no matter how much I tried to earn their approval, I would always be the punchline. And that realization brought a strange, unexpected feeling, relief. Because if they were never going to change, then I didn't have to keep trying. I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness of the quiet suburban street. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I drove away. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. And for the first time in my entire life, silence felt like freedom. The first year after I cut contact with my family was harder than I ever expected. People imagine that walking away from toxic relatives feels like instant freedom, like stepping out of a burning building and breathing fresh air for the first time. In reality, it feels more complicated than that. Yes, the fire is gone, but the smoke lingers in your lungs for a long time afterward. For months, I kept reaching for my phone without thinking. When something good happened at work, my instinct was still to text my mom. When something stressful happened, I still had the urge to call someone in my family and vent. Each time I remembered there was no one on the other side of that call anymore, or at least no one who deserved to be there. The silence that had once felt peaceful slowly started to feel heavy. Holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving came only a few months after I left. Everywhere I looked, people were talking about traveling home, cooking with their parents, and catching up with siblings they hadn't seen all year. At the bookstore where I worked, customers chatted happily about family dinners and crowded living rooms filled with laughter. I smiled politely and asked if they needed help finding anything. Then I went home to my small apartment and heated up a frozen dinner. I tried to pretend it didn't matter. Mark refused to let me spend the day alone. He showed up with a grocery bag full of food and insisted on cooking Thanksgiving dinner in my tiny kitchen. The turkey was slightly overcooked, the mashed potatoes were lumpy, and we forgot to buy cranberry sauce entirely. But we laughed the entire time. For a few hours, the quiet ache in my chest faded. Mark had been there through the worst part of my relationship with my family. He had watched the way their comments chipped away at my confidence, little by little. He was the one who held my hand after the engagement party when I cried in the car for almost an hour. "You don't deserve that," he kept saying softly. At the time, I wasn't sure I believed him. The strange thing about growing up in a toxic environment is that it slowly rewires your understanding of what love looks like. When criticism and mockery are constant, they start to feel normal. It takes time to realize that kindness isn't supposed to feel rare. For a while, Mark was the only person in my life who reminded me of that. But healing changes people. And sometimes relationships that begin in pain don't survive once the healing really starts. About 2 years after I left my family, Mark and I sat across from each other at the same small kitchen table where we had eaten that messy Thanksgiving dinner. Neither of us was angry. If anything, the moment felt strangely calm. "I think we've grown in different directions," he said gently. I stared down at my coffee mug, tracing the rim with my finger. "I was thinking the same thing," I admitted. There was no dramatic breakup, no accusations or betrayal. Just two people realizing they had reached the end of a chapter. We hugged before he left. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt painfully quiet. For a few days, I was terrified that losing both my family and my relationship would push me into the kind of loneliness people never recover from. But something surprising happened instead. I didn't fall apart. 7 years earlier, that kind of loss probably would have shattered me completely. But the version of me who had walked away from my parents was already learning how to survive on her own. Instead of collapsing, I started rebuilding. I went back to school part-time, finishing the degree I had abandoned when my parents convinced me it was impractical. They had always rolled their eyes at my love for writing and art, insisting that those interests would never lead to a real career. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking their voices for permission. Around the same time, I began working on a small project during my free hours. It started as nothing more than a creative outlet, handmade stationery designed with watercolor illustrations and short quotes about resilience. I opened a small online shop just to see if anyone might be interested. At first, the orders were tiny, a few notebooks here and there, a couple greeting cards purchased by strangers who stumbled across my page. Every time I received an order notification, I felt a strange surge of excitement. Someone out there liked something I had created. That feeling was addictive. Slowly, the orders increased. Customers started leaving kind reviews. A small blog featured my designs in an article about handmade products. Within a year, my little hobby was making more money than my part-time job at the bookstore. The growth felt unreal. I spent long nights at my kitchen table packaging orders, printing shipping labels, and sketching new designs while listening to music. For the first time in my life, my work didn't feel like something I had to prove to someone else. It felt like something that belonged entirely to me. 3 years after leaving my family, I rented a tiny studio space downtown so I could keep up with the growing demand. 5 years after leaving, I hired my first employee, then another, and another. Before I fully realized what was happening, my small online shop had grown into a thriving stationery brand with customers across the country. The girl whose little projects had once been dismissed at the dinner table was now running a company. But the most important change wasn't financial success. It was peace. Without the constant criticism from my parents and brother, my mind finally felt quiet. I no longer woke up every morning feeling like I had something to prove. For the first time, my life belonged to me. 7 years passed like that. 7 years without phone calls from my parents. 7 years without awkward family dinners. 7 years of birthdays, holidays, and milestones that existed without them. Sometimes the silence felt strange, but it never felt painful the way it once had. Until the night my phone started vibrating across the coffee table. I was 30 years old by then, sitting on my couch in my apartment after a long workday. My company had just finished preparing for a large holiday order shipment, and I was halfway through a documentary when my phone lit up. Unknown number. I frowned and let it ring. Telemarketers called all the time. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Same unknown number. I ignored it again. Then it rang a third time, and a fourth, and a fifth. By the 10th call, irritation had replaced curiosity. Whoever it was clearly wasn't planning to stop. I grabbed the phone and answered. Hello? For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then faint breathing, and a voice I hadn't heard in 7 years. Emily? My stomach dropped instantly. It was my mother. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I didn't say a word. Instead, I hung up. My hands were shaking as I stared at the phone screen. 7 years. 7 entire years without hearing that voice. For a moment, I just sat there trying to steady my breathing. Then I did the one thing I had promised myself I would always do if they ever tried to reach me again. I blocked the number. Problem solved. Or at least, that's what I thought. Because 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Then another. And another. Voicemail notifications started appearing faster than I could clear them. When the calls finally stopped, I opened my phone and stared at the screen in disbelief. 43 voicemails, all left within the span of a single night. And every one of them came from a different number. A cold feeling settled in my chest. Something was very wrong. And somehow, after 7 peaceful years, my family had found their way back into my life. I didn't listen to the voicemails right away. After seeing the number, 43 messages stacked one after another, I set the phone down on the table like it might explode if I touched it again. My first instinct was to ignore them completely. For 7 years, I had built my life around distance, silence, and the careful boundaries that protected my peace. Opening those messages felt like unlocking a door I had spent nearly a decade trying to seal shut. So I didn't touch the phone for the rest of the night. Instead, I turned the television back on and tried to focus on the documentary I had been watching. But the narrator's voice blurred into background noise. My attention kept drifting to the phone sitting face down on the coffee table. 43 voicemails. People don't leave that many messages unless something is very wrong, or unless they want something badly enough to ignore every boundary you've set. Around midnight, I gave up pretending I could relax. I turned off the television, brushed my teeth, and went to bed, but sleep came in shallow waves. Every time I drifted off, my mind pulled me back to the same question. Why now? 7 years had passed without a single attempt to contact me. No birthday calls, no holiday messages, not even an angry text demanding to know why I had disappeared. At the time, I had assumed they simply didn't care enough to try. Now suddenly, they were calling from dozens of different numbers like their lives depended on it. That thought made my stomach twist. Morning arrived too quickly. Sunlight crept through the blinds, casting pale lines across my kitchen floor as I brewed coffee. I moved through the apartment slowly, trying to stretch out the quiet normalcy of the morning, before confronting whatever waited inside those messages. But eventually, curiosity won. I carried my coffee mug to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened the voicemail app. 43 new messages stared back at me. The first one had been left at 8:12 p.m. I took a deep breath and pressed play. My mother's voice filled the room. Emily, please call us back. Her tone was cautious, almost uncertain, like she wasn't sure whether I would even listen. The message was short, barely 10 seconds long. The second voicemail came 5 minutes later. Emily, it's Mom again. We really need to talk. I felt my shoulders tense. The third voicemail arrived only 2 minutes after that. Sweetheart, please pick up the phone. Her voice sounded thinner this time, strained in a way I didn't remember. I stared at the screen for a moment before pressing play again. By the fifth message, my mother's calm tone had started to crack. Emily, I know you're probably upset with us, but this is important. Please call me back. By the seventh voicemail, she sounded like she had been crying. Emily, please, just listen. I leaned back in my chair, gripping my coffee mug tightly. 7 years. 7 years of silence. And now suddenly she was begging. I kept listening. By voicemail number 10, the panic in her voice was obvious. We really need your help. That sentence made my chest tighten. In 30 years of life, my parents had never once asked me for help with anything. The idea alone felt strange. Message 11 was another tearful plea. Message 12 was just heavy breathing and the sound of someone whispering in the background before the line disconnected. When I reached message 14, my father's voice finally appeared. Emily, it's Dad. Hearing him speak after so many years felt like opening an old wound that had almost healed. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Tired. We need to talk about something important, he continued. Call us back. No apology, no acknowledgement of the past. Just the same blunt tone he had always used when discussing practical matters. I kept listening. Voicemail number 17 was from my mother again. This is really serious, Emily. Please don't ignore us. Her voice cracked on the last word. By the time I reached voicemail 23, I was bracing myself for every new message. That was the one where everything changed. Emily, it's Dad again. There was a pause before he spoke again. We need your help. I froze. The words echoed in the quiet kitchen. Help. That single word carried more weight than anything else they had said, because my parents had never seen me as someone capable of helping anyone. Sighs. To them, I had always been the child who needed guidance, correction, improvement. The disappointing daughter, the one who could never quite measure up. Hearing my father admit they needed me felt surreal. But the next message explained why. Voicemail 24. My mother again, voice shaking. Emily, we're in a really difficult situation. There was a long pause, followed by a soft sob. Your brother's company, it didn't work out. My stomach dropped. Daniel's startup had been the center of my parents' world for years before I left. Every family dinner had revolved around his ambitious plans, his investors, his vision for the future. My parents talked about it like it was already a guaranteed success. Apparently, that hadn't turned out to be true. Voicemail 26 filled in the rest. We invested everything, my father said bluntly. I sat, perfectly still. Everything. Their savings, their retirement, their future. Even after 7 years of silence, I knew exactly what that meant. They had believed in Daniel so completely that they had risked their entire financial security on him, and something had gone terribly wrong. The messages after that became increasingly desperate. We might lose the house, my mother whispered in voicemail 30. Please call us, she said again in message 32. By the time I reached message 40, I felt emotionally drained. Then came the final voicemail. Number 43. The voice that spoke this time belonged to Daniel. I almost skipped it. For years, my brother had been the loudest voice in the background of my childhood pain. His jokes, his smug confidence, his effortless ability to command our parents' attention. Part of me didn't want to hear him again, but curiosity won. I pressed play. Hey, Em? His voice sounded different, less confident than I remembered. I know we haven't talked in a long time, he continued awkwardly. There was a long pause, like he was searching for the right words. Things are really bad right now. More silence. Then he said the sentence that made everything click into place. Mom and Dad are about to lose the house. I stared at the phone screen as the message continued. We heard about your business, he said quietly. You're doing really well now." There it was, the real reason behind the 43 voicemails. Not reconciliation, not regret. Opportunity. 7 years without a single attempt to repair the relationship. 7 years where I existed outside their world, and the moment they needed something valuable, they found me. I closed the voicemail app slowly and leaned back in my chair. Outside my window, the city was waking up. Cars moved through the streets below, people heading to work, coffee shops opening their doors for the morning rush. Normal life. Meanwhile, my past had just knocked loudly on the door I had closed 7 years earlier. I sat there for a long time, thinking about the girl who had left home at 23. Back then, hearing those messages would have shattered me. I would have felt guilty, responsible, desperate to prove I was still a good daughter. But the woman sitting in that kitchen was not the same person. 7 years changes people. 7 years teaches you who deserves access to your life and who doesn't. And in that quiet moment, I realized something important. Family doesn't get unlimited chances to hurt you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to reopen the door. For 3 days, I ignored the messages. At first, it was easy. I told myself that I had already made my choice years ago when I walked out of my parents' house with 2 suitcases and no intention of coming back. Listening to the voicemails had already been more engagement than I owed them. But the calls didn't stop. New numbers kept appearing on my phone. Some came in the morning, others late at night. A few rang while I was at work, vibrating in my pocket while I tried to focus on meetings and emails. I blocked each one as it came, but another would appear the next day. Voicemails continued piling up, too. I didn't listen to those. Once had been enough. Still, the persistence gnawed at the edges of my mind. Not because I felt guilty, but because I could feel the desperation behind it. The kind of desperation people only show when they have run out of options. And apparently, my family had run out of them. On the fourth day, curiosity finally pushed me past my stubborn silence. I didn't call my parents. I called Daniel. His number had been included in one of the voicemails. I had saved it without thinking when I first listened, though I hadn't intended to use it. Now, I sat at my desk in my apartment, staring at the screen as the phone rang. It didn't even finish the first ring. "Emily?" His voice burst through the speaker with immediate urgency. "Oh my God, Emily, thank you for calling." The relief in his voice was almost startling. For a moment, I just listened to him breathe on the other end of the line. "We've been trying to reach you," he continued quickly, like he was afraid I might hang up if he paused. "I noticed," I replied calmly. There was a brief silence, and I could practically hear him trying to decide how to approach the conversation. Then he gave up on subtlety. "We really need your help." Straight to the point. No apology. No awkward attempt to acknowledge the 7 years of silence between us. Just business. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the city skyline beyond my apartment building. "How much?" I asked. Another pause. This one was longer. "Emily?" "How much?" I repeated. My voice was steady. After a few seconds, he sighed. 800,000. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. $800,000. The number was so large that it felt almost unreal, like something pulled from a movie script rather than a real conversation. Then, unexpectedly, I laughed. The sound surprised both of us. Not because the situation was funny, but because the sheer absurdity of it hit me all at once. "Daniel," I said slowly, "you haven't spoken to me in 7 years. "Yeah, but—" "And now you're asking me for almost $1 million. It's not just for me," he rushed to explain. "Mom and Dad could lose the house." There it was again. The house. The same house where every childhood memory lived. The same house where my parents had laughed at my humiliation during my engagement party. The same house where I'd spent years feeling like an unwanted guest in my own family. I let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "Do you remember my engagement party?" I asked. The question caught him off guard. "What?" "My engagement party," I repeated. "The one where you made a toast." Silence filled the line. I imagined him sitting somewhere in that old house, rubbing the back of his neck the way he used to when conversations became uncomfortable. "Emily, come on," he muttered. "I remember it very clearly," I continued. "You stood up and told everyone you were surprised anyone wanted to marry me." He didn't respond. "You remember how Mom laughed?" I asked quietly. Still, nothing. And Dad just sat there smiling like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "Emily, that was years ago?" "No," I interrupted gently. That was the moment I realized something. He exhaled in frustration. "What?" "That none of you respected me." The words hung in the air between us. For years, I had never said them out loud. Back then, I had been too busy convincing myself the problem was me, that I was too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. But distance had given me perspective, and perspective had given me clarity. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice tightening, "this isn't the time to rehash old stuff." I almost smiled. Of course it wasn't. It was never the right time to talk about the things that hurt me. Not when Daniel's business needed attention. Not when my parents were embarrassed. Not when acknowledging the past might force them to face the consequences of their behavior. "You don't get to rewrite history now that you're broke," I said calmly. His tone shifted instantly. "Wow." The word came out sharp. "So that's how it's going to be?" I stayed quiet. "You're really going to let Mom and Dad lose everything?" he continued. There it was, the guilt tactic, predictable. It was the same strategy they had used my entire life whenever I tried to set boundaries. If I disagreed with them, I was selfish. If I stood up for myself, I was ungrateful. If I walked away, I was cruel. I looked out the window again, watching a bus move slowly through traffic several stories below. The city looked peaceful from up here, a life completely separate from the one Daniel was still living. "You already did that," I said quietly. "What?" he snapped. "You lost everything," I replied. "You convinced them to invest their entire future in your company." "That's not fair," he shot back immediately. "They believed in me." "Yes," I said. "They always did." The unspoken truth between those words didn't need explanation. They had believed in him. Always. No matter what. Meanwhile, I had spent my entire childhood trying to prove I was worth believing in at all. "You're being incredibly cold right now," Daniel said. Maybe I was. Or maybe I had simply learned the difference between compassion and obligation. 7 years ago, I would have been drowning in guilt during this conversation. I would have felt responsible for fixing the situation somehow. But the woman sitting in my apartment now understood something the younger version of me never had. Their choices were not my responsibility. "You're asking the wrong person for help," I said. "Emily, I hope things work out," I added calmly. Then I ended the call. The silence in my apartment returned immediately. For a few seconds, I just sat there holding the phone, waiting to see if I felt anything. Anger, guilt, sadness. But what I felt instead was something else entirely. Relief. The kind of relief that only comes when you realize you've truly moved on from something that once had power over you. 7 years ago, walking away from my family had been the hardest decision of my life. Now, saying no felt easy. For the first time in a very long time, I understood exactly how far I had come. I thought that conversation with Daniel would be the end of it. After I hung up, the silence in my apartment felt calm again, like the surface of water settling after someone throws a stone. For a few days, nothing happened. No new numbers calling my phone, no voicemails piling up overnight. Part of me wondered if they had finally understood. Maybe Daniel had explained that I wasn't going to step in and fix the consequences of their decisions. Maybe my parents had realized that 7 years of silence wasn't something that could be erased with a desperate phone call. But families like mine rarely give up quietly. 2 weeks later, I was sitting at my desk in the studio reviewing design samples for a new stationery collection when my laptop chimed with a new email notification. Normally, I ignored emails during work hours unless they came from my team or business partners. But something about the subject line caught my attention immediately. Final notice. The sender's address was unfamiliar, a long string of numbers and letters from a free email provider. But the moment I opened it and saw the first line, I knew exactly who it was. My mother. The message was long, longer than any email she had ever sent me before. I leaned back in my chair and started reading. The first few paragraphs were written in the emotional, dramatic tone I remembered from childhood. She talked about family, about sacrifice, about how parents spend their entire lives raising their children and expect loyalty in return. She wrote about the good years when we were all together. According to her version of the story, our family had once been close and loving. She described holidays filled with laughter, dinners where we shared stories about our days, and a home where everyone supported each other. Reading it felt surreal. I wondered if she truly believed that version of events, or if she simply hoped I had forgotten the truth. As the email continued, the tone shifted. The emotional appeals turned sharper. She reminded me that they had paid for part of my college tuition years earlier. She mentioned the food they had put on the table while I was growing up, the clothes they had bought, the roof they had provided. Each sentence felt like a line item in an invisible bill, a debt she believed I owed. Then she moved on to Daniel. She wrote about how hard he had worked on his company, how devastated he was by the failure, how much pressure he was under trying to fix everything. He always believed in his dreams, she wrote. The same sentence she had used to defend him when we were children. It was strange reading those words now. Even after everything that had happened, the pattern hadn't changed. Daniel was still the center of the story. I was still the supporting character expected to step in and help when things went wrong. Near the end of the email, she finally mentioned the real problem. The bank, the house, the debt that had swallowed their savings and left them scrambling for solutions. "We have run out of options," she wrote. That sentence sat alone in its own paragraph, as if she expected it to carry enormous emotional weight. Then came the part that made me pause. She mentioned my company. Apparently, they had done their research. "We heard about your business," she wrote. "You seem to be doing very well for yourself." There was something almost resentful hidden beneath those words. As if my success was surprising. As if it was something I had stumbled into accidentally rather than built through years of work. The final paragraph was where the mask slipped completely. "If you refuse to help us, Sharon, we will have no choice but to tell everyone how selfish you are." I read that line twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because it was almost impressive how predictable it was. 7 years had passed, yet their strategy remained exactly the same. When kindness didn't work, they tried guilt. When guilt didn't work, they tried shame. The idea that public opinion might control my choices had been one of their favorite tools when I was younger. What would the neighbors think? What would the family say? How embarrassing it would be if people knew I was a bad daughter. For a long time, those threats had worked. I had bent over backward, trying to avoid disappointing them. But something changes when you spend years building a life that doesn't depend on their approval. their words lose their power. I stared at the email for a moment longer, then closed my eyes and let out a slow breath. 7 years ago, receiving a message like this would have ruined my entire week. I would have felt angry, hurt, defensive. Now I mostly felt tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from working long hours or staying up too late. The kind of tired that comes from recognizing an old pattern you've outgrown. For a few minutes, I considered ignoring the email completely. Silence had served me well for years, but something about that last line, the threat, the assumption that I would panic at the thought of being called selfish, made me reconsider. They still believed they understood me. They still believed I was the same girl who left their house feeling small and uncertain. Maybe it was time to show them how wrong they were. So instead of writing a long reply or defending myself against their accusations, I opened the photo gallery on my phone. A picture from the previous week caught my eye immediately. It had been taken at a business awards ceremony downtown. I hadn't even planned on attending at first. One of my employees had insisted, saying our company had been nominated for a local entrepreneurship award. I had gone mostly to support the team. Winning hadn't even crossed my mind. But when they announced my name and I walked onto the stage to accept the glass trophy, something inside me shifted. For years, I had built my life quietly, focusing on the work itself rather than recognition. Standing on that stage felt like proof that the girl whose ideas had once been dismissed as little projects had been capable of far more than anyone in that house believed. In the photo, I was smiling. The trophy was in my hand, and behind me a large screen displayed the title of the award, Entrepreneur of the Year. I attached the photo to the email. Then I wrote a single sentence beneath it. Turns out I wasn't the family joke after all. I didn't add anything else. No insults, no explanations. Just the photo, and the truth they had spent years refusing to see. After sending it, I blocked the email address immediately. Then I went through my phone and blocked every remaining number that had tried to contact me over the past few weeks. It took less than 5 minutes. When I finished, I closed the laptop and sat quietly in my chair. The studio around me hummed with the quiet energy of people working, printers running, keyboards clicking, someone laughing softly in the next room. My life. A life that had grown far beyond the narrow role my family once expected me to play. Sometimes people imagine justice as something loud and dramatic, a confrontation, an apology, a moment where everyone finally admits they were wrong. But the older I got, the more I realized justice can be something much quieter than that. Sometimes justice is simply living well enough that the people who underestimated you have to face the truth on their own. No speeches required, no second chances offered. Just distance and peace. And the quiet understanding that the chapter you closed years ago will stay closed forever.